Welcome to Authors Alcove. I am your host, Agnes Wolfe. Today, I have fantasy adventure writer Zach Lindsay, author of The River Against the Sea, which came out at the end of 2023. He has a master's in anthropology, and he has used his knowledge of cultures to help him build fictional worlds, ethnography of our heroes. Did I pronounce all of that right?
Yep, absolutely. And thanks for having me here. I really appreciate it, and I'm super pumped to be here. I've listened to your podcast before, and I'm excited to add to the knowledge that other writers have shared with you.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us today. I always appreciate that you guys take your time out of your schedule. Could you just share just a little bit about yourself and what's got you into the writing world?
Yeah, so ever since I was little, my mom read me fantasy novels. I mean, when I was very little, she was reading me out loud these very dense things like Terry Brooks and stuff. So not the most dramatic. It wasn't like she was reading me George Martin or something, but she was definitely reading me very intense fantasy works, even when I was probably too young to really be absorbing all that stuff. I remember her reading me Jurassic Park, and I remember the thing that was surprising to me about it as a young person was how much math was in it. So I really connected heavily with these kinds of fantasy works when I was little. And as I got older, of course, the first place that I started reading was fantasy. And I think I wrote my first fantasy short story when I was in fourth grade or something like that. It did not make any sense, of course, but it was there. And as I got older, I kept writing, but I ended up writing nonfiction, and I wrote as a journalist for a while. And what I realized as a journalist, and maybe other writers have not had this realization yet, so be careful if you have not. If you really like to write and you really like to write fiction, working in writing is maybe not the best idea because you're going to be burned out by the time that you get home. If you've already written six different stories about the city government, you're not going to want to go home and work on your fantasy novel. And so I kind of put fiction writing aside for a long time until I got a little older. I started to work as a teacher. And when I worked as a teacher, I had more time when I was done with teaching where I actually wanted to tell stories again. And so that's when I started to get back into writing more seriously. And I taught through the AmeriCorps program. So when I was done teaching, I got a lot of money for college, which was very helpful. And so I ended up going back to school to get my degree in anthropology. And I specifically studied the anthropology of art, and I focused on the ancient Maya people. Today, I live in Quintana Roo, Mexico, which is where Maya folks live today. And so because of that, I'm really connected to the Maya community. And a lot of my knowledge and my passion are related to that community.
My roommate actually had a minor in anthropology, and I always thought that would be so fascinating to study. I also actually read to my kids. I would say they're denser, but they're not quite as dense as what you were talking that your mom was reading. But like I'll read, you know, middle grade to my 4-year-olds and my 7-year-olds. So hopefully they end up learning a love of fantasy as well.
I
But
think it'll work.
yeah, I hope so. So before we get into the world building and character development, I want to know a little bit about the book that you've recently written. Could you share a basic plot without sharing any spoilers?
Yeah, so the river against the sea is the idea of in Mesoamerican poetry, there's a concept called diphrasism when you sort of compare contrasting ideas to talk about whole. And so in my book, there are these two rival political factions, and one of them kind of has the nickname the river because they're related to to national trade, and the other is the sea because they're related to international trade, and they get into it. And as the story goes on, it becomes clear that there is some more stuff going on behind the scenes. But the plot to me is not really what is, I mean, I like the plot. I hope that other people like the plot as well, but the plot is not what really interests me about the book. What really interests me about the book is the characters in the book. And those characters are going to go through the experience of a trilogy. So they're going to get they're going to get beat up a little bit. So over the course of 3 books, all 3 of them are already written, and one of them is coming out in May. The next one, the second one, is coming out in May. So the plot of the first one obviously contributes to the plot of the later ones, but what's really interesting for me is getting to develop these characters over the course of the whole story and telling about them from, you know, beginning to end of their narrative journeys. And also, when I wrote this book, it was sort of at the height of Game of Thrones. And my wife really does not like Game of Thrones at all. It was too dark for her. So with this story, I really wanted to, although there is, I just told you the serious Civil War plot, right? That the plot of the book is actually not where the tone comes from. The tone comes from the way that the characters interact with each other. So it does have a little bit more of a sense of humor to it, and it has a sense of hope to it. And although there is this political stuff in the background, I try to keep that in the background so that the characters get the chance to really shine.
One thing I really liked on your application to be on the show was your inspiration for your character. Do you mind sharing that with my audience?
Yeah, so I already mentioned, right, that my wife doesn't like Game of Thrones, and that influenced the book. Well, the main character in the book, whose name is Essimor Darkenchild, she's a bureaucrat. She's this very competent young woman who's getting started in the real world for the first time. And of course, when you do that, you have to realize that competence is one thing, but being able to talk to people is something different. And she ends up having to sort of save her friends and her newfound family members from themselves and from an ancient evil. And the character was originally a Dungeons and Dragons character that my wife created. So my wife really developed a lot of the character. My wife always has this funny sense of backstory with Dungeons and Dragons characters that I get a kick out of. You know, everyone always wants their Dungeons and Dragons character to have, they're a former king who was deposed and their family was killed and now they're out adventuring and whatever. And her backstories have always been these very simple, I didn't like home because it was boring or something, so I left. And I really thought that was a fun twist. We oftentimes have motivations, character motivations are so deep and related to trauma and that sort of thing that we thought it'd be really funny to play with a character whose motivations were literally, my hometown was boring and I want to be on the ocean and sleep in a hammock. And that is really where her motivations start. Of course, she's put in life or death situations that force her to maybe develop motivations more related to not dying. But that's really where the motivation, the idea for her motivation comes from. And that was all my wife. And we created this D&D character, and we were going to play a campaign that was based in, it was sort of like a 1600s style world. And then my wife got pregnant, which is awesome, and probably the only good reason to not play a Dungeons and Dragons game. And so, of course, we had to put the game aside. Then when we had our daughter, we found out that she absolutely hates sleep more than like anything. She's really not a big fan of it. She dropped her nap before like every other toddler. We, you know, in Mexico, it's true that in some places in Mexico, they take an afternoon nap. So I would love to take an afternoon nap because it gets very hot in the afternoon. Daughter absolutely refuses. She hates naps. So when she was a newborn, like 3 or 4 months old, up to 6 or 7 months, if we put on the TV, she would wake up immediately. If we put on music, she would wake up immediately. So the only thing we had to do around the house to kind of bond together was first we read all the comic books in the house out loud. And after we were done with that, I was like, well, the only thing left to do is to write a story about this Dungeons and Dragons character that you love so much. And that's where the book comes from.
Did she help you write it at all, or was it all you?
So she contributed in small ways. I read the manuscript to her, and as she was listening, she would often kind of throw in snide little comments here and there. And the funny thing is, I predicted some of those comments. So some of those comments are already things that were in the book. But if she said something that I thought was particularly funny or that sounded like the voice of the character, I stuck that line in. But I actually knew my wife well enough to be able to predict some of the things that she was going to say about different scenarios beforehand anyway. So I was a little bit proud of that. But she did help with the character. I asked her if she wanted co-writing credits, and she absolutely refused. So I did give her copyright to the character if she ever decides that she wants to do her own thing with it.
Cool. I also had my 7-year-old was one of those babies that did not sleep. You hear that they sleep like 80% of the day when they're newborns, and I'm like, that is not the case.
Who are these
And
children?
she still is my night owl. Like, she will stay up until I force her to go to bed. Like, if like New Year's, she has no problem staying up till midnight. Never has. But anyway, you
Yep.
mentioned that you use anthropology when my words are not coming out. So you mentioned that you use anthropology when world building. Still not coming out. For those who don't know, anthropology is the study of cultures. So this is what you studied and have a master's in. Do you mind sharing what the process is and how it shaped your writing? And specifically this particular book.
Sure. So anthropology has a lot of moving parts to it. So a lot of folks don't necessarily. I've met people who have gotten their bachelor's in anthropology without actually really knowing completely what it is. I think the easiest way to think of anthropology is it's the study of learned behaviors, right? We learn things from other people and then we do those things. And anthropology is interested in how we learn those behaviors, why they're so important to us, and what strategies we kind of use as problem-solving methods to cope with different environments and that sort of thing. And learned behaviors are oftentimes manifested in public. So a lot of anthropology focuses on things like rituals and festivals and that sort of thing. But we also do a lot of learned behaviors in private. The way that we even brush our teeth is a learned behavior. There are lots of different ways to brush your teeth. Some cultures use sticks to chew on. The ancient Maya used to use sugarless gum to brush their teeth. And I understand that some people who work in that profession still use gum as a way of brushing their teeth when they're out in the field. So there's lots of different ways to do it. A lot of times we don't think too much about it, though. We just go into the bathroom and brush our teeth. And we don't really think that that behavior is actually influenced by years and years of cultural development. So we divide anthropology into 4 fields. We divide anthropology into cultural anthropology or social anthropology, which is the study of those learned behaviors that I mentioned in the present, and specifically cultural anthropology is really interested in people getting together in groups and how people behave when they're in groups. Then we have linguistic anthropology. Linguistic anthropology talks about accents and how people perceive accents. And we have biological anthropology, which is honestly probably the most useful of them because it is also sometimes called forensic anthropology, and those guys solve crimes. I had a lot of friends who did forensic or biological anthropology who are now doing really amazing things and helping to repatriate remains and that sort of thing. But at its heart, what biological anthropology does is it looks at the human body and it finds ways of noticing those learned behaviors that I mentioned in a human skeleton. So for example, in our teeth, you can analyze chemicals in our teeth, chemicals like strontium, and those chemicals can be used to determine where a person comes from. So that's one of the ways that biological anthropologists can study a person's life processes. Finally, we have archaeology. A lot of times people think of archaeology as collecting pots, so they're kind of surprised when they hear that it's part of anthropology. But actually, the real goal of archaeology is to not just collect the pot, but figure out the behavioral practices that surrounded the pot making. And those 4 things I just told you, you're probably like, well, how does that in any way apply to fiction? And it really does apply a lot because when we're creating fantasy worlds, all those things that I just mentioned are really important to human behavior. And when we start to think about things like elves and orcs and hobbits and their second breakfasts, which is such a perfect example of how you can look at a culture through a fictional culture through the lens of anthropology, those are actually things that are really helpful when you're considering world building.
One thing that I find very interesting, I was teaching a history class one time, and I had for a few years. And the thing I would tell them every year was that when we're looking at a culture, we're going to look at it through their lens, through their eyes. And so the first example I would give is those in Africa, the women who are wearing no shirts, and their chest is hanging out, are they modest? Are they dressing modestly? And the kids instantly say, no, no, no. And I'm like, in their culture, they are. That's exactly appropriate for their culture. And so then we would start giving other examples of that. So that way, when we were actually learning about history, we were learning through the lens of the culture itself. And that's kind of what this kind of reminds me of, something that I was teaching in our history class. But what cultures most influenced your book, The River Against the Sea?
Yeah, so that's a very great point, and that is definitely something that, and we'll talk a little bit more about what you just said when I talk a little bit about culture, character-based world building. So with my book, the biggest influences are definitely Caribbean and Mesoamerican culture. The reason that happened is because that's where I live, and that's where, it's the old write what you know. So it actually didn't happen because of my methods of world building. So I didn't start off saying, I want to write a book that has Mesoamerican culture, or I didn't start off saying, I want to write a book about Caribbean culture, but in a fantasy world. And when we really get into the character-driven world building concept, well, I'll talk a little bit about why that's not really the best idea. But basically, the reason is because, especially if it's not the culture that you were born and raised in, a lot of times it can lead to stereotypes, and some of those stereotypes can be pretty harmful. I've definitely seen online people saying things like, oh, I'm going to change the example, so this isn't exactly what I saw online, but I've definitely seen folks being like, I want to create a Korean culture that is, the orcs of my world are a Korean culture or something like that. And I think that is a very dicey way of starting things. I think a lot of times it can, again, it can cement stereotypes because cultures are built through sort of a feedback relationship with their environments and with their neighboring cultures. So Korean culture would not have developed in a different situation than what it developed in. Can a fictional culture have elements of Korean culture in it? Absolutely. But the way that you need to do that needs to have a certain logic to it. So if you just start off, it's not the end of the world. Like, I'm not saying that you're a terrible person for doing that, right? But if you just start off with, I want my X to be X, sometimes you can start to get into some pretty dangerous territory. So my world is not necessarily intentionally Mesoamerican. I just use some of the themes that I have been exposed to over the last few years as influence on the book.
So, one of the ways that you help character build is called the ethnography of our heroes. Do you mind describing what that is and how you learned about it and how it applies to writing?
Yeah, so when I started off realizing that I wanted to use anthropology in fictional world building, my first thought was, well, in the past, one of the things that I've done is, what does the world look like? What's the geology of it? When did the gods create it and that sort of thing? And what influence do the gods have on the world? So I took those kind of questions and I said, what are the major festivals going on? And what are the funerary practices and that sort of thing? And I realized that those questions weren't necessarily bad, but they didn't get at what I was hoping to get at. So I sort of went back to the drawing board and I said, what am I missing here, right? Why is this not working for me the way that I want it to work? And I realized that anthropology is a science. We collect data. And what I didn't have was data because I'm making it all up. So I can make up the data, but I didn't have the data. So I started to think, well, how do anthropologists collect data? Maybe that's the key. And what I realized, of course, is that anthropologists sit down and they do interviews with people from a culture. One of the best examples that we have of this is Margaret Mead. She has her famous book, Coming of Age in Samoa. And what she did in that book was she sat down and interviewed young women in Samoan culture. And she asked them all kinds of different questions about not just their sexuality, which was the main topic of the book, but all kinds of questions about everything in their lives. And she used that data to reconstruct the culture. Now, you can probably imagine that when you're reconstructing a culture that way, if you're only asking all the young women things, you're going to be missing out on certain aspects of the culture, right? Because you're only getting a small segment of the culture. On the other hand, you're able to effectively build a model of the culture. And the more work you do interviewing people, the more people you interview, the more complex that culture is going to be. And you're not just going to understand what people do, you're going to understand why they do those things. So I looked back at my anthropological questions that I was asking, what kind of festivals are there in my world? And I realized, well, the problem is I shouldn't really be asking what kind of festivals are there in the world. I should pick a character, probably the main character to start off with, but not just the main character. I should pick a character and I should start to do an ethnography of them. A lot of writers already do this sort of thing when they're building their characters out. They say, well, I'm going to answer questions like who are her parents? What's her favorite food? That sort of thing, right? And what are some of her special skills that she has? These are questions that writers already ask already. So I don't think it's adding a whole lot to the process if you then ask questions that are more focused on the world building and the culture around the person. So again, not what festivals are there in my world, but how does my character feel about those festivals? What are her favorite festivals? What festivals does she hate? Why does she hate those festivals? What about it connects? Everybody, if you ask someone what's their favorite holiday, you're going to get all kinds of different answers, and you're going to learn a heck of a lot about a person just by asking them what their favorite holiday is. If you think about it, you know that a person is one type of person if their favorite holiday is Halloween, and another type of person if their favorite holiday is Christmas. And so it's one thing for me to say Halloween and Christmas are both holidays that are celebrated in this world. It's another thing for me to say my character's favorite holiday is Halloween because XXX reason. So that's what the ethnography of our heroes sort of started off as. I call it that because I feel like everything needs like a fancy hashtaggy title these days. My wife is not sold on it, so maybe it'll change. But I say the word heroes. It doesn't have to be just the heroes. In fact, my preference is that you do your heroes and your villain, at least one of the villains, because the villain always gets the short end of the stick. We need to do just as much development on, in my opinion, you should be developing your villain just as much as you're developing your hero. And when you're doing that work, the villain also needs to be related to the culture that they have in that world. How does the villain feel about different elements of culture? If your villain is a very conservative person and there are big changes happening in the world, their reaction to those changes will help you understand your villain more. And it'll also provide a lot of details that you can drop into the book. So in real life anthropology, during ethnographies, we try our best to interview. Usually what happens is a small group of people get focused interviews, really intense interviews that are very long. Sometimes they take place over years. I'm not saying you need to interview your character for years, but in real life anthropology, that's oftentimes what happens. And then maybe what'll happen is they'll give surveys to the rest of the people in town. And some people will fill out those surveys and other people won't. And then they use the data from those surveys to influence things as well. So to go back to the example of festivals, if you ask your main character what their favorite festivals are and why, maybe also ask some of the backup characters what their favorite festivals are, but don't bother yourself taking hours and hours to do it, right? It should be a pretty short process. And in my opinion, if you're doing it correctly, it's not really going far out of beyond the realm of what you're already doing in the character generation process. So that's one of the reasons that I really like it, is it didn't add a whole lot of work to what I was doing. And the other reason that I like it is I think it really teaches you a lot of things about your character that you might not think about otherwise. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific things that I learned about my character using this method, but I did just kind of want to give you an overview of it. So I like to think of it as a fictionalized version of the scientific process of interviewing lots of people in order to collect data.
What's interesting about that is I realized that I have done the same thing with my particular story that I'm writing, except for I did it backwards. Like, I think I would have saved myself work because mine actually has a festival. And I was thinking specifically of that festival, but I was thinking of different parts too that I could interview the characters. But as my story progressed, I realized I have to change the festival because it begins in a festival. And I realized I have to change it because I realized, oh, this person feels this way. So maybe I need to add this to that. And, things are changing. Whereas if I would have done that work up front, there'd be less editing now that I'm starting the editing process. But
Yep.
so one of
And
the
in
things,
my opinion, that is the perfect reason to use this method, right? Because again, it gets at not just what is happening in your world, but why we as readers should care, because we're invested in these characters. If the character hates the festival by the end of the story, we're probably not going to like the festival very much either. And if the character loves the festival, hopefully by the end of the story, we're going to love the festival too.
for me, my character does not like this particular festival, but other people really like it. And that was the only focus. But I didn't think about the other main characters until as the story progressed. And I realized, I didn't ask them what their feelings were, because then when I go back, I'm like, you know what, when I go back to write or editing that, I want to add this person's perspective on this aspect because it will shape further down in the road, further down in the story, because I realized that those tie in, but now I have to do the work twice because I didn't do the questions first. But anyway, one of the things you mentioned is that using this method creates a very character-focused book. What are the benefits of having a character-driven book as opposed to a plot-driven book?
Yeah, so the example that I always use of this is I'm sure there's somebody who has done this, but in my experience, most people who like fantasy don't read the Silmarillion first, right? They read The Hobbit first, or they read The Lord of the Rings first, and then they go back to the Silmarillion because they're already invested in the world. Why are they invested in the world? Not because the world is cool. The world is cool. The world is amazing. The world has a ton of detail to it. It's such a great world, and it's worth investing in. But you're invested in the world in my the way that I did it anyway, and everybody is different, I'm sure. But first, when I was very young, I watched the cartoon version of The Hobbit, and I was immediately like, oh my God, I love Bilbo so much. And then I went on and I read The Hobbit. And after I read The Hobbit, I loved Bilbo so much that I wanted to read about what happened to Frodo. And I was way too young when I read the trilogy. I totally skipped half of Two Towers, so I still don't really know what happens in that book. But I was invested in the character, right? And that's the truth is, in most great writing, we remember the people. The plot is important. It's important to have a great plot. I'm not saying you should skimp on the plot, but what we really pull out of a story ends up being the characters, right? And if you ask a regular Joe on the street who's not like a huge comic book fan or something like that, if you say, tell me a Captain America story, they're probably not going to be able to tell you a specific story. They're going to say things like, oh, well, I don't know, he punched some Nazis, right? He threw his shield around, right? They're going to tell you things about the character and how he reacted to his world. And so when we as writers create a story, we really want, again, the world needs to be detailed. All that information needs to be there for a good story. I'm not saying it doesn't. But the most important thing for the readers to take away, in my opinion, in 5 years, I don't want you to remember, I told you at the beginning, I mentioned that my story has this political, conflict going on. I don't want you to remember that in 5 years. What I want you to remember, what I hope you remember from my book, is the character. And I hope that you think of her fondly, and maybe even, well, I had a really great moment where my mom's boss read the book, actually, and my character does this hand motion. There's a joke about her hand motion that she's a very magical being. So she does this like creepy downward triangle hand motion a lot, and everyone thinks that it's some kind of magical sign, but it's actually just her anxiety. It's something that she does to kind of combat her own anxiety. So it has no power whatsoever, but she does it whenever she's very anxious. So everyone around her thinks that it's a very powerful symbol of magic. And my mom's boss was having a bad day, and she started doing that downward triangle sign. And that really like filled me with I just loved to hear that she had picked up that detail, right? Again, I don't care that she probably doesn't remember what exactly what king got shot and what king didn't and blah 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 blah. What she remembers is the character. And so whenever we're writing as again, I love a good fictional world that you can really get lost in, but usually really people connect to the characters first and the world second. So that's why I think it's so important to make sure that you're really designing your world around how your characters feel about that world.
I do find it interesting because I was thinking of my favorite books, and it's the characters I remember, but I couldn't probably tell you the exact plot line, but I could tell you about the characters. Like Harry Potter, for example, people fell in love with Harry Potter. They didn't necessarily fall in love with the plot. So when you were writing
Yep.
your current trilogy, what were some questions you asked your main character that really helped you write a better book?
Yeah, so my main character, one of the jokes of the books is that she comes from a land that is known in their world to be hell. But to her, it's just her hometown. So she has sort of, to her, it's very boring. Nothing interesting happens there. It's the middle of the desert. Everybody who has never been there has heard stories of people being eaten and flayed there, and if you steal a library book, they'll kill you and that sort of thing. And so, you know, the world or her city to everyone else is very scary. To her, it's very normalized. So right at the beginning, I came up with this idea that she was going to eat hearts. She's like very cute and innocent looking, and she, you know, does a lot of finger pointing and is annoyed with you, and she refuses to curse, even though she's surrounded by sailors who are cursing constantly. Yet she also eats people. So so balancing that, I had to figure out like what does she actually think about eating people? And it's really mostly a funeral custom. So her people, when one of their people die, they have a magic bead in their heart. When one of their people die, the other people in town consume the remains in like a ceremonial way. And one of the people in town will ingest the magic bead, and then they can go on and have a child. So this is how the race kind of perpetuates itself. So I had to think a lot about what, you know, their diet looked like. So a lot of my questions about the book were, what is Essie's diet like? What does she think about different types of food? And I thought it would be kind of funny if as much as she's known to eat, you know, the remains of the dead, she is also kind of a picky eater in other senses. So you see her, you know, sort of joking or being very blasé about the idea of eating someone, but then she's very grossed out by hardtack soup, which is just like onion soup with little croutons in it, basically, you know. And so that was one of the questions that I asked. Related to that question, I was really interested in burial practices because she works for, well, her people work for the god of death. And so they're very interested in burials and burial practices. And so I wanted to know what she wanted to have happen to her when she dies. And I think this is a really, really, really valuable question to ask that a lot of people don't really think about so much. Again, people might think, you might ask, what are the burial practices in my culture? But what you need to be asking is, how does my character feel about those burial practices? It's an especially great question if your character is a traveler. So again, Essie comes from a city in the desert. Now she's on the ocean. When she dies, she hopes that someone eats her, but her crew members are not super pumped to eat her. So she has to deal with the fact that she might not get what she wants to happen to her when she dies. So that gives her a certain level of anxiety that a lot of travelers throughout time have actually had, but we don't really think about too much, especially in an era when, you know, the world is a little bit more secular than it was in the past. In the past, it was really important, and it still is for many cultures. It was really important what happened to your remains. It was really important that your body was buried facing east, or that you were cremated, or, you know, XXX happened to your body when you died. And there was a lot of anxiety for folks whom that might not happen to. Another way of playing that in the book or in a fantasy world is, so in the past, in certain places in Europe, after the body was died. I always like to say after, because I've heard people write this as though this was happening to living people, and this is not happening to living people. But after someone died, sometimes they would disfigure the remains in a way, like breaking the jaw with a brick or that sort of thing, or putting an iron spike through the skull. And maybe you, as a fantasy writer, or folks who are interested in fantasy fiction, you're already starting to think why someone might do that. And the answer, of course, is to prevent them from rising again as the undead. And so the bodies were handled in a way to prevent them from rising again as the undead. So that I can imagine that if you lived in an area where that was the case, you would be a little bit anxious to think that maybe someone's not going to handle your body properly after you die. And if you live in a fantasy world where you very well can come back as the undead, you would probably be even more anxious about it. So I have a character in the book who is a little bit of a coward. And I realize that he is very afraid of coming back as the undead. So to him, it's very important that someone smash his jaw after he dies, because he does not want to come back as the undead. And that's a very real concern. I haven't actually had the chance to play this into a story, but I've been considering how this can really be used as a narrative foreshadowing method. So if you know that everyone smashes their jaw after a person is dead, and you go into a cemetery and there's a random body without a smashed jaw, and somehow the body's out of the cemetery, you're going to start to get very frightened of that body very quickly, right? So those questions about opinions and feelings, because again, the question is not how do they handle the dead? The question is, how does my character feel about those death rituals? And those questions really helped me to create this ongoing complex relationship that the character has between life and death, and her own feelings about her mortality, in a way that is very, very specific to the book. And I actually wanted to mention this, but I forgot, so I hope you don't mind me going back a little bit. I mentioned earlier why it's so important not to just port real cultures into your book. And this is the reason, because you actually get things that are a lot more complex and interesting when, instead of saying, I want this to be an Aztec culture, but in a fantasy world, when you start to develop your character and you say, well, what does the character care about? What does the character feel about these things? And if you start to pull in things from Aztec culture, nothing wrong with that. That's totally fine if those details make sense for your character's feelings and your character's desires. And a lot of times what ends up happening is, or at least I mean, people may disagree, but I feel like with my book, in the end, there are elements of Mesoamerican culture in the book, but it is clearly not Mesoamerican culture. There are a lot of things that are not Mesoamerican that the culture has in it. And those things came into the culture organically through asking questions about how they might live on islands, or that sort of thing, how people might live on islands, and how people would feel about the ceremonies that they have.
I think that everything that you shared is really going to shape how I edit my book, because there were a lot of things that were going on in my head as you're talking. But I think one of the main reasons why we got to be careful and you kind of mentioned this already, but pulling out from another culture is because of the why. Like, if you don't understand the why of why that culture does it, it is going to sound more stereotypical. It is going to sound more judgmental, because you're not understanding the underlying of where that particular custom came from, or what that particular dress, or whatever it is. But anyway, I just want to thank you so much for being here. I do want to ask you, are you currently reading anything? And is there a author, book, or series that has impacted you as a writer?
Yeah, so I saw that question in the notes you sent me, and I was like, oh man, it really depends on what day, right? I feel like every writer is probably that way. Their biggest influence depends on what day. I initially thought of saying Terry Pratchett because my book has a little bit of his tonal elements. It is meant to be a funnier book. It's meant to be a book with a realistic plot and silly characters. And so there are some people have compared it to, it's sort of like The Black Company, if you've heard of that book, which is this very serious fantasy book from the 1980s where it explores the lives of, instead of looking at the high court and stuff like that, he focused on the doctor in the book. And I thought that was really, somebody else mentioned that it reminded them of the Black Company. And I thought that was really cool because the doctor in my book is actually based on the doctor from the Black Company. But it's like the Black Company told by Terry Pratchett, right? It's again, it has more of a humorous element to it. But the real book that has inspired me more than any book, and I could read it over and over again. I'm not the kind of person that likes to read books more than one time, so it's not super easy for me to read a book a second time, and very rarely read books third times or more. The only book the book that I've read the most is The Once and Future King by T.H. White, and I just absolutely love that book. And actually, there's some tonal things in that book that are consistent with what I was trying to do as well, right? And so we have these characters who have a lot of times very deep trauma. They're trying to figure out how to live with that trauma. There are some very sad elements to the book. And then yet you'll be reading about the terrible abuse of Gawain when he's a child, or Gawain when he's a child, and then we'll flip over to them chasing the questing beast and dressing up like the questing beast and doing all this very silly stuff. And I really loved that contrast between, again, like deep resonant emotions where you feel sad for the characters, even when they're doing bad things, you still feel sad for them because he's done such a good job of explaining why you should feel sad for them. And yet there are these moments of absolute absurd levity in the book. And I hope that I've kind of captured that with my book as well.
I've actually not read that. I'll have to look it up afterwards.
Oh,
But
it's
thank you
fabulous.
again so much. Before we leave, I do want to ask you the question that I ask everyone, and is what is one piece of advice that you would give to a not yet published author?
Yeah, so one, start saving money now, because if you're going the self-publishing route, it's not cheap, right? It's not cheap to pay for advertising and covers and designs and all that sort of thing. But that if you have a passion for it, the money is not what matters to you, I assume. So what I would say is sit down and freaking write, because I have a friend who has an absolutely brilliant story in his mind, and he's been working on an outline for this story for more than 5 years. I think going on 10 years now. And I recently asked him, when are you just going to sit down and write the freaking thing? And he was like, well, I'm going to be taking this long vacation to Croatia. And while I'm there, I'm going to do some more research and I'm going to try to get better at writing. And then when I get home from that vacation, and I was like, no, dude, sit down and write it already. And I know that it feels tough because you sit in front of a blank page and you're worried. And there's a great quote by Neil Gaiman. I don't remember the exact quote. I don't have it here with me. But he basically said, to paraphrase him, you can edit garbage, but you can't edit a blank page, right? So if you get the garbage down and you look at it and you're like, holy crap, this is garbage, you can edit it, right? So don't worry about the blank page. Put some strings of nonsense words or put a few phrases, adjectives about what your character is like. Again, to go back to that character focus thing, if the first few things you write on the page are what your character is like, or themes that you want to explore in the book, just so that you have something on the page, and then just start writing. And I know a lot of people are like, but I want to get better at the craft first and that sort of thing. The way to get better at the craft is to do it. So I highly recommend that if you're sitting there and you're like, what should I do to really be ready? The thing to do is to write. So that's
Thank
what
you
I would
again.
say.
Thank you again, Zach. I also want to thank my listeners for listening as well. If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy listening to a fantasy writer, Sarah Page. She loves banter. Sounds like they're very similar in adding that funny element to a fantasy story, as well as Anna Michelle, who wrote Long Live the Queen. Thank you again. You can find a link to his website socials. I had the privilege of talking with Zach Lindsay, author of the fantasy novel The River Against the Sea. And again, thank you very much, Zach.
And thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you for joining us on this magical journey through Author's Alcove, the reading nook. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. And remember, this episode is brought to you by Noadays.com, a company that offers many courses from how to become a freelance writer to proofreading and editing. I have personally taken some of these courses, and I am very happy with what I learned. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, you can find the affiliate link in the show notes. I would love for you to join me on my other two podcasts as well, Author's Alcove, The Writing Corner, where we talk about everything writing, publishing, and marketing, as well as Author's Alcove, The Healing Corner, where authors share their books on healing and recovery. Until next time, keep reading, keep dreaming, and we'll see you in the next chapter.